then I would like to invite you, Thomas Roer from Denmark, to this episode of Beyond the Reasonable Doubt, Season 3. As you know, Thomas, the topic of this year's season is implementation of investigative interviewing. So, although you no longer work for the Danish police authority, you have worked for them for quite some time and you are deeply engaged in investigative practice in Denmark still. So it's an honor to have you here today and welcome.
Thank you very much, Ivar. Thank you. And thank you much for inviting me as well. It's a big honor for me. So I'm looking forward to a nice conversation.
Fantastic, Thomas. Thanks a lot. You and me go quite far back. So some of these questions I'm quite sure that we share opinions on, but could be really nice to see if we can discuss them and look at them during these next 40 minutes. So I will then invite you, Thomas, to share with me and our listeners what do you think is the ethos of investigative interviewing?
Well, the ethos, at least from my perspective, is, well, I think the overarching ethos is do no harm. But I also think there's another side to it, which is it also has to get the job done as well. So it's do no harm, but get the job done. And by saying that, I mean that we need safeguards, but we also need efficiency in our investigative interviewing practice so that we get the information that we need while taking care of the people that we need to safeguard as well. So it's a double-edged sword, you might say, although I must say it's of course heavier on the safeguard part, though.
That's a really good answer. If we try to reflect critically, don't you think our colleagues that came a generation before us would say that they did exactly the same?
Probably did. They would probably say the same. I would say so as well. Well, the thing is also about philosophy is how much credence should be put on this double-edged sword, you might say. I think maybe there is still two edges, but I think the safeguard edge is becoming slightly heavier these days than the efficiency part of it. Although they're still both there, I would say it's more towards the safeguards than the efficiency. Whereas opposed to earlier on, I would say it was probably more efficiency as opposed to safeguards, if that analogy makes any sense.
Definitely. It definitely does. It's about, as you say, I think it's a really good analogy, having your sword sharp, but how to use it in a safer way. Huh?
Yes. Yeah, that's a very good way of putting it, actually. I think maybe it's not about the sword itself, but about the wielding of the sword, you might say. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a very good analogy, actually. Yeah.
So if you take us into a Danish context, Thomas, what would you say is the situation in Denmark today? And if you look back in the years you've been involved in strategic and development there, why is this development important for Denmark?
Well, if we start out with a slight historical perspective, you would say that back in 2010 or something like that, we had a very good researcher, one you know as well, Christina Kepinska Jacobsen, who did some very interesting research on interviewing of suspects. And before that, she had done some research on general witness interviewing as well. Very important work. And they tried to build upon that, to expand upon that, changing the landscape, you might say, on investigative interviewing. But it was still fragmented. So there wasn't a national standard of this is how we do investigative interviewing in Denmark, and at that stage, the Danish police. There were still different, shall we say, perspective on how to approach interviewing from district to district. Although I will say, probably overarching, they were probably reasonably in agreement, but there was no standard. I was part of a work group and had the pleasure of leading one of the projects there on developing the new and current standard of investigative interviewing in the Danish police, which were implemented in 2015. In 2015, we had the new Danish standard for investigative interviewing, which was national. So now there could not be any different perspective. It was one perspective. At least that's the idea, isn't it? And in practice, of course, there are still some shall we say, challenges on perspective for different approaches to investigative interviewing. But that was it. And that also meant that in 2015, training in investigative interviewing started to being implemented on a much larger scale than we were used to. Not big enough, but it was bigger at that stage anyway. There was a lot of basic programs, just I think 1 or 3 days, just to get a quick starter, an appetite, if you will say. And then there, of course, were further courses being done after that. For the volume crime, there is a course there. And of course, there was also a course for video interviewing of child interviews. And that's where we are now. And it's still where we are here now, 10 years after. I think they have been doing a few more local initiatives on trying to expand upon the current training regime, if you might say, with mixed successes. They've tried to do a bit further training on trauma-informed interviewing approaches for sexual assault victims. So there's definitely still being done some things there. Now, you talk about what's the status in Denmark. Well, in Denmark, the status is that what's really interesting here is that we implemented this in 2015, but in 2021, for the first time, and I think almost 100 years, we had 2 police officers convicted of trying to coerce a confession, which was quite surprising, to be honest, because we had this new standard and it's been implementing it, but apparently not well enough, you might say. So yeah, that's quite interesting. We also had another officer who was charged with, but acquitted though, of trying to coerce a confession last year in 2024, which is also quite interesting. And which also talks into what's the status in Denmark right now. Well, I think the status is that we've implemented investigative interviewing while developing the Danish model of interviewing, but implementation-wise, we still have some way to travel. We still have some way to travel. We're not there yet in the Danish police anyway. And when I say it like that, it's because, as you may be aware, I also train the Danish immigration services at this stage, and they have fully adopted investigative interviewing as the standard. They don't have a standard per se, but they do have the standard and the principles behind investigative interviewing. And they actually do a lot of implementation. Everybody is being onboarded using this method. No one is allowed to be there for a number of months before they have to go through this course as well. And there's 2 courses, basic and an advanced, and there's also a child interviewing course there. So and that's another aspect, of course, of all this, is the police is not alone. There's a number of actors that employ the principles of investigative interviewing in Denmark anyway. And I'm sure it's the same around the globe as well.
We talked about what is the ethos of investigative interviewing. Well, in my world, Thomas, it's probably not about interviewing at all. It is about how you think about an investigation and what your job is. As we often talk about what I call the change of mindset. And the mindset that is traditionally more of a guilt-perceptive, confirmatory style, which is not only something that comes because you're a police officer, but is 100% human to be suspicious and to be confirmative of that suspicion, if that's your job to investigate. And if you don't do anything about that, it will not change the mindset.
That is very true, Ivar. I absolutely agree. It is very much a mindset change. And also, you might say investigative interviewing and investigative practice very much relies on professional critical thinking skills and mostly actually metacognition. I would say would be one of the more important aspects of the critical thinking aspect, again, of investigative interviewing and investigative practice. Thinking, why am I thinking this? What am I basing this on? Asking questions to your own thinking.
Yep.
Is something of the most difficult aspects of this methodology or mindset, if you will. And it is very often it is something that is being trained as an appendix, something that we do We could do a bit about bias, can't we, Thomas? Can you put a bit about bias in? A bit about system 1 and system 2 thinking. Can you do a bit about that? But mostly we want something about techniques. And in some ways you should maybe switch that around and have a focus on the mindset aspect and a minor aspect of it on the techniques and methodologies, in some ways anyway.
That's so interesting. Of course, a very hard thing to do. I remember, Thomas, many years ago when I was approaching this task in Norway together with my good friend and brother in arms, Asbjørn Raclef, I was actually called up by the director of the National Criminal Investigation Service in Norway, Kripos. His name was Arne Huse, and he was quite a famous man in Norway at that time. And he called me and said, I was a very young officer at that time, and I was there for only 6 months, but hopefully I would go on. But that was typical that homicide unit, they wanted to see and evaluate you before they gave you a permanent position, because you work and traveled in teams around the country. The social part was quite important. But then he called me and said, I've heard that you want to do this master's in forensic and investigative psychology in England, and tell me why. And I told him why, but at the same time, my boss, the head of the homicide department, wanted to join me in that meeting with the director. And he was clearly not a fan of me going to England, because he was one of the older, you could say, gurus of confession-based interviewing in Norway. He was afraid it was going to be threatening his kingdom, I think. And so he couldn't say no to the director, but he was clearly showing that he was not a fan of it, and also not a fan that a young officer should do such a thing. You have to send one of the older guys, he said. The director, he actually told him off in front of me and said, listen, what this young man is asking for is not support to stay 2 years on a beach in Thailand. He's asking for some support to go through a series of exams and hard work on a university in England. You understand that? He said to me, my boss. And he said, yes. And he said, they'll help him do it then. And just get out of here. And on the way out of his office, he stopped me and took my arm and said, Ivar, if you have any more problems with this guy, come straight to me. And I think that is the kind of direction you need from high-level officers. If people if you're going to change, have the kind of the guts that it takes to take on change in a national police culture. If you think about that story, Thomas, and relate that to the top management of the Danish police, have you seen similar agendas, or you could say change cultures?
Interesting question, Ivar. I'd have to say no, not directly like that. Definitely not like that. I think the closest thing we have was when there was a number of years in Denmark where we had a bachelor's degree in police. And while we had that, the top management were very much involved in training police officers for master's degrees to get the right level of reflection, but also to get the accreditation you needed to do that. But even then, it was more practical aspect as opposed to a visionary aspect. It was not because anyone had the idea that we are going towards evidence-based policing, although that has been attempted multiple times in Denmark as well. And I'd say it's still being tried to do evidence-based policing. No, we haven't had the visionary aspects of that, although I think maybe the idea of evidence-based policing is probably the best example of top management being involved and saying we want this, but at the same time not really understanding what it is they want.
Exactly.
Which makes it very difficult once they become aware of what it really is, if they ever become aware, and thus making the implementation of it very difficult in the police force. So no, unfortunately, I don't have such actually, I would say the story on doing masters for my part is almost the complete opposite. I did my master. Well, when I was accepted at also a British university, I wrote everybody in the Danish police, from the head of the police, Rigspolitichef, to my own district leaders. Everybody, I asked them, saying, "Hey, I have this opportunity. I've been accepted. It's a great opportunity. Would you like to support that?" And they all responded by saying, "What a wonderful opportunity for you. Have fun doing that on your own.
Okay.
Because we will not support you." But of course, while saying that, I will say that my managers, my chiefs at my local district actually supported me in the way they could. They could not support me financially, but they did
No.
support me with time, which was something I was very grateful for. But just to say that the top level, to be a bit, how shall I say, critical, is not exactly visionary. It's practical.
Exactly. No, I'm just saying that from a Norwegian perspective, which of course is not, we're not talking about right or wrong here, Thomas. We can't say that only history will tell. But what I think is that I can just look back in the mirror from when I started as a detective in Oslo in the early 1990s. Copenhagen was always very close. I think closer than it is today. We had a really close cooperation, and we learned a lot from each other. I think to be even more correct, I think we learned a lot from the Danish. I went there and stayed and worked there for months as a trainee at Politigården and learned a lot. I think Denmark, methodologically, in many ways, was a little bit bigger city, a little bit more modern. And we learned a lot from Denmark when it comes to generic policing. But when it comes to this topic that we're talking about now, I have a feeling that I'm kind of missing Denmark in a way on the international stage, because there is no secret that Norway has been a country that has advanced a lot when it comes to this change. And I think it's very interesting why Denmark is not on the international stage with the same message. Because normally you think about Denmark as a country that leads on when it comes to human rights and modernizing and being a modern liberal democracy.
Yes, absolutely. I agree with you. And I would say, actually, how shall I put this? Well, Denmark is a very closed organization. Danish police. I'm imagining that's probably similar to very many other police forces, but there's no, or at least there's a very small research community looking into the police practice. And it's very difficult to do that because the police is very closed around itself, right? So that means that all knowledge is something that are tacit, and it's very difficult to develop on tacit knowledge.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
So I think that's the biggest problem in Denmark, actually. So there's been a lot of experience and hard-earned experience. It's all tacit. So there's no development. And when there is development, it's going to be very practical oriented, meaning that it's going to be, we need a new piece of software, or we need a new weapon of a kind. So it's more in that approach, as opposed to we need a new methodology to do things.
Exactly.
At least within the investigative sphere, which is quite interesting, actually, because there have been some huge development within the more, shall we say, operational part of the police force. Patrol officers. There has been a lot of concept developments within that. Danish police has the dialogue concept for dealing with riots and hooliganism, and we have different approaches to. Back in the 1993, we had a big uproar on how we approach riot controls. It was pretty much standing with a shield and getting hit. And that went to a huge uproar. And afterwards, we have a new tactics, which is more almost going back in time for the Viking Age, which is called hit and run. So you go in, you take out the antagonist, the bannerman, and then move out again. So I would say within that part of the police force, there's actually still is being some development done, although still it's not based on necessarily research, at least not Danish research. But within the investigative practice, we're not there yet. Although, of course, as I mentioned initially, it was a breakthrough 10 years back when we had the new standard for investigative interviewing. So there have been some attempts to do something, but it's not being properly implemented in the Danish police. We miss people like your chief. We miss people that will stand up and say, we will not be doing this anymore. We will be doing this.
Absolutely. And later on, as you're probably well aware of, also the Attorney General of Norway has been really clear that there are no other ways. This is the way to do it. And they have declared that in written in national circulars, which is non-negotiable. And that takes me to our next topic, Thomas, and thank you for being so open and frank about this, because I don't really like to talk about Denmark in a not so good way. It's one of my favorite countries and favorite people in the world. So thank you for being honest and scrutinizing this not so comfortable topic.
You're welcome.
That brings me to another topic. Do you record all your interviews in the Danish police today? Or not you, but as far as you know, does the Danish police record their interviews?
They record some of their interviews. All child interviews are being recorded. And there was a trial, and it's been running for a couple of years now, where you can record interviews of sexual assault victims and use that in a court setting as well afterwards. But it's having mixed results. Not everybody wants to do it. Actually, the defense attorneys are not necessarily very happy about the victims being recorded on their interviewings, mostly actually because it turns out that some defense attorneys will refrain from asking the critical questions during the recording and instead do that interviewing in court. Because as it is today, even though sexual assault victims are recorded doing their interviews, they still need to go into court and answer, whatever kind of extra questions that might have arisen during the investigation or whatever. And they have had the feeling that some of these defense attorneys aren't being upfront initially. So that means that the victims are actually feel that they have to go through another interview, which was actually the opposite effect, right? So no, not everybody records interview. And then there can, of course, still be some districts have implemented interviewing in other settings and can use that in other settings, as in homicides or other serious offenses. They can choose to record their interviews, but they're not obligated to record the interviews.
Exactly.
So that's a big difference, right? They can do it, but they're not obligated to do it. And I don't know how many they actually choose to record it and how many they don't choose to record it. The transparency on that one is difficult, which is non-existent actually. So we don't really know.
Yeah. We're speculating in it.
Yeah. And also, I feel like I need to mention. Now you said yourself earlier on that it's difficult to talk bad about the Danish police, and I think it is. I was part of the police for 18 years. But I also feel like mentioning that there is a lot of very committed, very talented investigators in the police and leaders as well. So it's not all bad.
No.
It's definitely not all bad, but there is some structure around them that needs to be changed for them to better work.
Sometimes I think about this as we're talking about here a systemic change, Thomas. You cannot blame the individuals inside the organizations.
Exactly.
It's a systemic change, I think, and trying to kind of link that to the individuals that would never actually be fruitful. So I completely agree. The reason I was interesting in interviewing and recording was that from a Norwegian point of view, that was actually what I think was the tipping point amongst many leading Norwegian detectives, when we agreed that we will try to do a national implementation of recording equipment, and that was already in 1998. They felt extremely insecure around touching that red button and starting recording themselves. And then they actually felt, my lord, I need some training. And I need some training that is backed by science, so that I will not make a fool of myself when I record my interviews. That's a very interesting link, I think, between recording and development.
Yes. And I think I would agree with you that if officers were obligated to record all their interviews, and those interviews had to be scrutinized
Exactly.
by either an outside authority or at least within the authority, not every interview, naturally, like some of your interviews, I think that would make a huge difference on implementation and quality, to be honest.
It's like we can quote the old British scientist Lord Kelvin: if it can't be measured, it can't be improved.
Yes.
It's part of the same thing. A last question, Thomas. I think we'll cut it short and say that if you look ahead then, also from a Danish perspective, but also broaden the perspective to, I know you also work a lot internationally, and next week you're going to the Caribbean and lecturing about these topics. So I'd like to just invite you to think about, if you look into the crystal ball and think ahead, what kind of innovations and technologies and policy change do you think we need to effectively support this kind of positive changes, both to investigations and to higher qualities in interviews? Is there anything you wish for or see coming?
That's a big question, Ivar.
It is. You can pick and choose.
Thank you. Well, I think globally, every officer is feeling pressured resources-wise. I think they feel like they don't have enough time to do quality work. So definitely, my hope for the future would be that we find suitable technologies that can help the officers manage an investigation and think. And I know that the last part is maybe a bit controversial, because I'd say that we want the officers to think for themselves, but they have been doing that for the past, 500 years, and too many errors occurs. So I would say we need decision support, something that can now, in these AI times, it must be possible to develop tools that can flag when something is interesting, saying, hey, during this interview, the interviewee said, this was a boring kiss. Flag it. What does that mean? You need to go further in that direction during the interview, or in a follow-up interview, or for the investigative SIOs, maybe flags is something else. Some flag is this hypothesis is weak. We need to strengthen the leads being followed in this direction, or this one is strong. Maybe we should see if we can make it even stronger. Something that can help them analyze the huge amount of data that comes onto their table. I mean, the sheer number of data packages coming into an investigation today is massive. We have just the forensic part of it, both cyber forensic and physical forensics. There's interviews. There's so many different aspects that we need to handle, to be honest. Well, you have to manage this information to know where you're investigating, which direction to investigate, or which directions to investigations, as in plural, right? So I think the hope would be to have technological support that could help the officers decide. Of course, again, that's also dangerous, because it might be that we will encourage a checklist investigative practice. If the system says go, it's all go. So we also still need to train the officers themselves. We still need to train the critical thinking. We still need to train the basics, but they need support. And I think that could be in the form of a technological advance in some way to help them that. So that was one of the questions you had. The huge question is, so policy-wise, that's more difficult, isn't it, in some ways? I think in Denmark at this stage, I hope that we're getting closer to what we might refer to critical mass. And when I'm talking about critical mass here, I'm talking about critical mass for change. So we have a lot of very gifted and talented officers, but we have some structures that needs to change. And I think the awareness that it's structural, I hope the critical mass is getting there in a Danish context. So there might be some changes on, for instance, moving away from new public management principles when trying to steer the police, and move more towards what is the aim of the police and measure that instead. Are you actually creating a safer and quality society for your citizens? Is it safe and crime-free? The last part is probably utopia, right? Or instead of just measuring then, well, if it's a case of violence, you have to do this within these 5 days, and then you have to do this within the next 10 days. I think that's a skewed way of measuring police efficiency. Definitely requires a policy change, a huge one. And I hope we're getting closer to critical mass where we can embrace that change and start a discussion on how do we create and maintain an efficient and legitimized police force in Denmark. Yeah, that was a huge question, Ivar, and yeah, I might have just taken it a bit far. I don't know. You have to rein me in if it was too much.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you, Thomas. I think it was a really interesting answer, and it made me think that, again, like we talk about, this change that we sometimes call investigative interviewing is also, in many ways, becomes like a denominator for something more, for what police work really should be circling around, and so that kind of fundamental change in how you think about your work. And I think that reflects your answer, that this is about something bigger. It's not just a technique.
No, definitely not just a technique. It is. Yeah, yeah. Well, Eva, we know you and I, we could talk about this, and we have been talking about this multiple times in the past. And I think there has to be a upper management awareness to do this change. But because I will be honest with you, I don't think the problem is the people on the floor. They want to do good. They want to do quality work, to be honest. They really want that. But they need their managers to help them do quality work. And the managers need also restraint, right? Because they have, shall we say, they have their managers. So it's top management level. We need top management level. And I'm not necessarily thinking this is within the police force itself, because the police has always been a political institution, and it still is. So actually, I think when we are talking about top managers, we also need to talk about the political level and how the political level needs to be being on board on changing the system around the police. I don't think it's enough, actually, to have the police managers. I think because those managers have managers, right? And those managers are from the Justice Department, and the Justice Department about the State Department, and so on and so forth. Yeah.
It's an interesting discussion, Thomas, because if you compare us with there are two big forces in a country that are supposed to keep the people safe. It's the police from the inside perspective, and it's the military from an outside perspective. And I relate what you say, that you need to equip your officers for the job that is expecting for them. And that requires big investments and technology. It's not only the people. And I think that it becomes even more clear if you compare the police with the armed forces, like Norway and Denmark and most of the other Northern European countries are now buying F-35s, and is an enormous investment to keep us safe and give us the technology necessary for a good pilot, do a good job, and be equipped against the threats and dangers that he will meet in doing this job. And now Norway is buying new frigates, the biggest warships we have. And it's, again, an enormous investment. If we want to equip our Navy officers to be able to do a good job in the Northern Atlantic, they cannot have equipment that is outdated and technology that is. And I think in many ways what you are saying reminds me that the same mindset is necessary when it comes to policing, all the way up to the parliament.
Yes, absolutely agree with you. Definitely they need the same mindset. But I think the difference between the armed forces and the police right now is that there's a lot of there's a lot of support right now. There's a lot of awareness, right? We have Ukraine conflict, the war in Ukraine. We have Israel and Hamas. We have a lot of war going around, which means that certainly pushes the agenda of these huge investments. And that's what I'm talking about. Critical mass is that we need a similar awareness on the police, and that's
Let's
difficult.
hope so.
Yes.
I've at least, Thomas, I would like to say that one wise man said once, when it comes to choosing your friends, it says that if you're the smartest persons in the room, you are in the wrong room. And today I think I was in the right room. And I will to say thanks a lot, Thomas, for a really engaging and nice conversation.
Thank you, Ivar. And I feel the same.
What an honor.
Yes. What an honor. Yes, indeed.